Hey guys, it's Johnny here from Spiritus People, and today is the first recording of a new series that I call the post-blind tasting. So a post-blind tasting is for me the additional tasting that you do once you've done a blind tasting with the context of knowing what you're drinking. When you do a blind tasting, obviously you do not know what it is that you're drinking, and your mind will spread you pretty thin in trying to detect those aromas and those flavors coming out of the glass. However, when you have context and you know what you're drinking, your mind is narrowed down and it's focused on what you should be smelling and what you should be tasting. So the differences there can actually vary quite a lot. And if you have those blind tastings where your mind is confused and you don't really know what to make of what it is that you have, then obviously tasting it with the context of knowing that, you're all of a sudden able to potentially pick out a little bit more detail. And also, given that you know what it is, everything just makes a lot more sense. So the purpose of these videos is to have another opportunity to learn more about nosing and tasting spirits. And obviously, if you listen to my podcast, the Spirits Blind Tasting Podcast, you will recognize these spirits because the spirits in these videos will be retasting of some of the spirits I've tasted before. If you do not listen to the podcast, don't worry about it. I'll put some clips in here just so you have a little bit of context of what my thoughts were. I'll also refer to my tasting notes that I made on the podcast. But obviously, if you do listen to the podcast, maybe this is a fun kind of post process of those notes, and also another opportunity to learn a little bit more. So there you have it. Hope you guys enjoy it. If you have any thoughts, any questions, any comments, feel free to drop them here below. And of course, I will link down below as well to the podcast if you want to check it out and subscribe to that as well. So there we go. Let's jump in. So in today's video, we'll be retasting an Irish whiskey, which was sent to me by Martinez, aka bourbon_patty on Instagram. And this is from the episode 11 of my podcast. So if you're interested in any of the notes that I have to say today, please go and check it out. As I said, there will be a link below. But as of this video, we'll be tasting the Glendalough 10-year-old Black Pitts Porter, which is an Irish Single Malt limited edition. Only 2 barrels went into this particular expression, and it was a collaboration between the Glendalough Distillery and the Five Lamp Brewery in Dublin. So I have these samples here that Martin has sent me with his amazing leftover Christmas labels. And what I'll do now is pop in a couple of sound bits from the podcast so that people that don't listen to the podcast have some context, and then I'll jump back in and I'll get into my nosing and tasting of whatever I have left here from the sample. We're also getting some apples. However, now we're looking at an baked apple. So it's a more dry sensation, and yeah, there's definitely a sweeter sensation in terms of like the sugariness of the apples on Spirit B here. So I put some baked apples in there in my notes. I also had some sultanas, and the lemon peel was also there, similar to Spirit A. However, on Spirit B here, rather than a fresh lemon peel, it was more of a dried lemon peel. There's some weird notes at the end there. The only thing I could think of was kind of a grassy note. So some things I normally get off a rye whiskey, or a very young rye whiskey. So the texture again is quite watery. However, it has that silkiness to it, and the viscosity is quite light. So the first thing we get on the palate is this sensation of the baked apples, which again was a very clear note that we were getting off the nose as well on this spirit. We're also now starting to see hints of the raw materials here, and we're seeing it in the shape of Maltesers. So it's this sensation of maltiness, but it's kind of a chocolatey version of that, and it's almost like a brittle or a chocolatey sensation, but it has that maltiness to it. So you're starting to see a little bit more of a malt characteristic to this spirit. And also we're getting the sultanas, which we also got from the nose, and now we're also starting to see that kind of the characteristics that would suggest some aging here. So we're getting some oak
and we're getting some burnt toast, and we're also getting some peppercorns, which is that kind of bitter sensation that you would get out of barrel aging.
All right, so in the podcast, when I was nosing and tasting the spirit here, I was going through this notion of trying to figure out, first of all, what's the category here. So pretty instantly and easily enough, I would put this in the kind of malt whiskey category without having to kind of think too much about it. It has those kind of fresh apple notes to it. It also has those kind of sultanas and stuff like that. So I'm still getting all of that. And I have my notes here, which I'll kind of refer to as I go through the video here, because there was not really that much additional stuff I was able to pick up on the notes here. Even now that I'm trying to think about what it is that I would be able to get out when something has been finished in a beer barrel, and in particular like on the porter side of things. So what I would expect is that kind of a little bit more acidity maybe, and a little bit more tanginess, that kind of bitterness that you get from a porter. I have not tried the Black Pitts porter, so I don't have a reference to that specific beer, but I've tried plenty of porters in my life, so I do have that kind of context of what that tastes like. However, finished in a barrel that's contained a porter, maybe not so much. I think this is potentially the first. So I'm a little bit lost in terms of like what I'm actually supposed to be nosing here, but I think that kind of tanginess and bitterness is some of the things that I would probably expect. But I think even at this point, as I may have mentioned before, is that I don't necessarily get just from the glass that this is an Irish whiskey. And I think that's the whole point of context. And because Martinez is based out of Ireland, it's easier for me to potentially assume that this is an Irish whiskey, whereas like if I had it completely blind from someone I didn't know, I probably would have put this in Scotland. See, I'm still getting a lot of those baked apples, sultanas, and I'm also getting the dried lemon peel that I had before. I apologize if I'm not looking at the camera. I have my notes here as reference. And also the kind of dried apricots. The grass, however, I'm not sure where I got that from. I'm not able to pick that out. So I had dry grass on the nose here from my blind tasting notes, and I'm not really getting any of that. So I don't know where that came from. If I mean, obviously your tasting spirits and everything that you eat ahead of time can affect your palate. So I do not remember what I had to eat that day, but yeah, the dry grass note, I'm definitely not able to pick that out. So on the ABV, my blind guess was around 45 to 50%, and I probably would guess that this is maybe not as high as that. I think I would probably put it maybe at 45%. The actual spirit here is 46, and I guess part of what the challenge is that when I do my blind tasting for the podcast, I always do two spirits. So when I have them side by side, obviously you're affected by the other spirit, although I do drink a lot of water, and I don't drink them immediately after each other, so there is a little bit of a gap. However, there is always this moment of comparison, which for me personally helps me when I do the blind tasting, because it's hard to blind taste just a single spirit without any kind of context or any kind of comparison. So right now, obviously, I know what it is, so it's a different scenario. But when I tasted this blind, I had another Irish whiskey next to it, which was a lower ABV, which then makes me think that I potentially thought this was a higher ABV than it actually is, because I was tasting it next to something that was lower. So my other notes from the blind tasting was that this had a dry sensation to it on the nose, and I definitely get that. I wasn't really able to pinpoint any other notes on it, and I find it most interesting that I'm not able to pick anything out from that kind of porter barrel, which I guess is kind of the key aspect here. Like, this has been finished in porter barrels, and now that I know that, I kind of want to get a little bit more out of that information, but on the nose, there's not really much more to pick out than what I had from my blind tasting. So is that a good thing or a bad thing? I'm not sure. I kind of now have this sense of almost like a slight disappointment that I'm not able to pick it out, or maybe a slight disappointment that I'm not really getting any of this, and the spirit doesn't really have much to offer. So the port barrel almost feels like it's a gimmick, but maybe the palate it's gonna change my mind. So yeah, let's taste it. I think on the texture, actually, from my blind assessment here, where I put it as a light viscosity, I think it definitely has a little bit more mouthfeel to it than I recall. And also in my notes here, I was referring to it as a very light viscosity. However, a very pronounced intensity on the palate, which I would definitely agree with. There's quite a few things coming through, and it's quite voluminous, but the texture actually is a lot more viscous than I recall, and I think I'd put down here. So yeah, I think that's potentially something that you could assign to that beer barrel finish. However, again, similar to the nose, like I don't necessarily feel like there's much on that porter barrel thing coming out of the spirit here on the palate. Maybe the viscosity is something, because obviously at 46%, like you might not have the best viscosity and you might not have the most kind of intensity on the palate there. It actually has quite a lot of notes coming through, which could be assigned to that beer barrel finish. But again, not something that I'm certain of, and I'm by no means an expert in that kind of stuff. But as I said before, this is meant to be an opportunity to learn and an opportunity to observe some of those things that you might be able to pick out with the context of knowing how something is made, where it's made, and that kind of stuff. So on the flavor characteristics here, just going back to my notes from the podcast here. So baked apples, Maltesers, sultanas, oak, burnt toast, and peppercorn. Like I'm getting all of that stuff. However, one thing that I also pointed out in my podcast when I tasted this blind was that there was this undefined nuttiness. And now it feels like there's a lot more of that kind of nutty flavor coming through. And I think it's almost like a cashew nut, where it feels like it's quite oily but also slightly neutral, and it has that kind of sensation of a unsalted cashew nut to me. And I feel like maybe what I wasn't able to pick out blind was that definition, but now it definitely feels like there's an oiliness to it, and it's like that nuttiness brings that oil and viscosity almost to the spirit. So I feel like there's definitely certain things here that I wasn't really able to pick out in my blind tasting that I'm starting to see now in the spirit. But as I keep coming back to, I'm not sure whether or not I can assign a lot of these things to the fact that I now know what it is. And does this taste 10 years old? Does this taste like an Irish single malt? Does it taste like it's been finished in port barrels? I don't think that I'll be able to say yes to any of those things. I don't think, potentially 10 years old. I'll say the age is the one thing where I feel like now that I know it's 10 years old, it definitely feels like a semi-young spirit. But also the fact that it's been finished in those beer barrels now makes me think that it feels a little bit more integrated on the flavors than I get on a lot of other 10-year-old single malt whiskeys. So I think the barrel definitely can be one of the responsible factors for the fact that there's a beautiful integration of those notes all across the aroma and the palate. So yeah, maybe there is something there. Finally on the finish here, so my blind assessment again was a medium finish with a lot of complexity And when I say a lot of complexity, what I mean is really just that there's like at least a couple of different aspects of the flavor characteristics that carry through, and I mean that beyond just the fact that you can get maybe some oak or some bitterness. Like, it's more like you have to have those kind of aroma characteristics and flavor characteristics to sit with you for a while. And I definitely agree with my assessment that was done blind, that it's medium finish, and those notes that I had in terms of the apples, and I think what did I put down here, char and peppercorn, I would agree with those, although the char, I'm not sure if that's actually a note of char. It feels like it's something else. Like, char to me is a little bit more of a very distinct characteristics that you would get clearly on some American whiskeys when you have like a newly charred barrel. Like, you get that kind of hard sensation of something that's been burnt. However, this one here, it feels like char, but potentially less harsh and less sharp. So maybe it's more of a toasted sensation, because I feel like the char, unless it's again something that comes from the porter barrel, is not something that I would assign to this whiskey particularly, in context of knowing what it is. Alright guys, that's it for this very first video of the post blind tasting series. I hope you guys enjoyed it. If you have any questions, any comments, any thoughts, please drop them in the comments below. I would love to hear from you. And yeah, as I'm sure this is the first video, there will be stuff that I can do better, so yeah, let me know. If you like this channel, please hit the subscribe button and also the bell icon if you want to get notified when new videos come out just like this, or any of my other videos that I post here on the channel. And finally, thanks to all of my Patreon supporters out there. With your support, I'm able to do these videos as well as all of the other stuff that I do. I really appreciate it. If you haven't joined me yet, please consider joining over on patreon.com/spiritspeople. And yeah, some fun stuff happening over there, some other videos, some giveaways, and all that kind of good stuff. So that's that. That's it. That's it for this video. Peace out, guys. See you next time.